right, friends. Good to see you again. I show you this mug because this mug actually is a vintage Victory mug from the ship that my father served on. So this is from the Kearsarge ship. Anyway, it's my favorite mug I have here in the studio. So today is video 3 of Vaccines Truth Over Tribe. And today, this video is going to be, it was kind of inspired actually as I was driving to the medical school library the other day, yesterday. I was passing by one of my neighbors. We live out in the country just a little bit, and one of my neighbors was walking out to the mailbox to get his mail, and he's an older logic, mathematics, computer professor who is just absolutely brilliant, just got one of those incredibly brilliant minds. He said he's written hundreds of thousands of lines of code, and his AI code is what's used by the military and all this. He's a brilliant guy. Anyway, so whenever I get a chance to visit with him, I like to tap into his experiences and his perspective. And I told him I was coming up to the library to look up some journals about vaccines, and he started talking about when he was a kid and how polio was a huge issue, and that at the time it was believed that you were at risk for polio during warmer times of the day, and also if you exerted yourself. So when he was young, they would let the kids out of class at noon to go home and just sit on the floor inside the houses and not exert yourself. Don't go out in the heat. He was, raised in Wichita Falls area, which is in North Texas. And he said he remembers very clearly how many people he knew that were affected by polio, and that polio was a huge scare. I mean, people were very, very afraid of polio. And then the polio vaccine came out, and he said it was truly like a gift from heaven. They were free to do things. They could go, and everybody rushed to get the polio vaccine. And it reminded me of where we came from with our ideas of vaccines. Vaccines were oftentimes thought of as a godsend, really. They saved people, and they made it to where we could get back to life as normal. And I started thinking about that, and started thinking about, where did the vaccine hesitancy come from? Well, it's interesting because actually, when somebody develops a vaccine, and I'll go over some of the history of some of these vaccines, but when somebody develops a vaccine, it's usually looked at as a good thing, and people are very willing to try it. Basically, as long as they feel like that vaccine is their choice, that's what makes a big difference. For example, if we go back to the history of vaccines, Edward Jenner developed a vaccine for smallpox in the late 1700s, and Louis Pasteur developed his vaccine for rabies in 1880s. But as we get into the 1900s, we get into 1914, there's the diphtheria antitoxin, and the BCG was vaccine for TB was developed in 1921. The yellow fever vaccine in 1936. So vaccines have been kind of going all along in the early 1900s. And then we get the amazing Salk and Sabin polio vaccines of the 50s. And that actually is a fascinating story. The whole story about Jonas Salk and developing his vaccine. And just a little shout out and a little recommendation. Dr. Mike does a great video on the history of Jonas Salk. And I thought it was just fascinating. It's the history of Jonas Salk, and the fact that he didn't ever patent that vaccine. He never made any money off of the polio vaccine, the Salk polio vaccine. And it was also the history of the March of Dimes was created to help fund the polio vaccine, and how everybody was very receptive of that. And it's just a very interesting video that Dr. Mike does on YouTube. So I would recommend seeing that. So then as I look through these other vaccines, we think about the vaccines on the childhood schedule now. And so you have the polio vaccine, the DPT vaccine, which was developed in 40s, 50s, and 60s. And you have the MMR vaccine that was developed in, looks like 1988, when they combined the three vaccines together. The Hib vaccine came out in the late 80s and early 90s for the conjugate Hib vaccine. And you have the hepatitis B vaccine that came out in 82. So we have all of these vaccines. A lot of these vaccines that are on the childhood schedule were developed over many years. And it's interesting because as you look up the history of vaccine hesitancy, basically people develop hesitancy whenever there is a vaccine mandate. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. And, a lot of what we're seeing right now really was just kicked into massive overdrive because of the COVID vaccine mandate. And it's interesting because when I think about the perception of the COVID vaccine when it first came out, it clearly was, it seemed as though it was almost like a miracle cure. President Trump pushed to get it through quickly. It seemed like it was going to be what kind of makes a big difference in making it to where we don't have to shelter in place as much. We don't have to worry about mask mandates as much and things like that. And it wasn't until it was mandated that it really started to meet resistance. Up until then, it was kind of welcomed as the technology that's going to save the day. But the mandate made it a very different deal. And that's been shown to happen through history every time that there's been any push for vaccine mandates. Anytime you force somebody to have to take a medication or a vaccine, it's going to cause some issues. And I think that's where the issues come in, are when these are mandated, okay? So I just wanted to kind of review a little bit with you some of the history and where this resistance comes in. It's a very natural and normal human reaction when somebody mandates a vaccine. And so what we're dealing with here is the fact that these vaccines are typically and generally well received until they're forced upon us and they're mandated. That's when we start to kind of bow up a little bit and say, I don't know that I want this. And unfortunately, it's also when people start really looking for reasons not to get it, or if they've been made to get it, they can have a lot of side effects of it that may or may not be all accurate. So we're going to get into that with with some of the next videos that we do. Anyway, this was video 3 of the series, Vaccines, Truth Over Tribe. Remember, we're going to keep doing these videos as we move through all of this vaccine information so that we get to understand this vaccine situation much better. No more sound bites. We're going to do the real stuff, okay? Thanks for sticking with me. Remember, more videos to come. Hang in there. I'll be back.